So when I was contacted to be part of this presentation, I was really excited because I had seen James' work before when I was in Taiwan, and also saw part of the exhibition he co-curated at the Taipei Biennale, and also myself. I have a long standing interest in issues on trauma and representation. So I'm also an artist, writer, and curator, and I teach at all of the artists in the visual studies and visual critical studies programs, and so I'm just going to give those presentations to James.
Xiaoyu's outside, but I want to thank her for inviting me here today. It makes sense that I come after Inti. He talked about disease, and I'm going to go right into that. So, for a few years now, as an artist, I follow my obsessions. One of those obsessions, obviously, is racism, because I grew up here in the United States. Another one of those obsessions is biological warfare. So, we start with a definition of biological. I'm going to start very simply for those people who might not know. So, this is a classical definition of biological warfare from Japanese scientist Tomisada Masuda, and this is a U.S. government translation of the 1942 lecture. Sometimes, instead of saying biological warfare, I will say BW. So just remember, that's biological warfare. So, BW is the act of employing pathogens to destroy living matters of the enemy and thereby attaining the more favorable position on our part are called BW. Pathogens include all types of bacteria, as well as protozoan, rickettsia, virus, etc. So, virus is not a bacteria. BW can be used against the enemy. It can also be used against those countries that might become allies of the enemy. So this definition is essentially a defense of the usefulness of biological warfare. There's an American cartoon version for the military. So you see it looks like a little animal, and it's to produce death or disease in man, animals, and plants. It's much quicker, much easier to understand. This was designed for soldiers who were drafted. I'm going to be talking about the Japanese biological warfare program from World War II or before. And this book that was published in 1994 is really the beginning of the discussion of Japanese biological warfare in the United States. This book also, once it was translated to Chinese, pushed the issue in China as well. So, after this book was published and then translated to Chinese, there were a group of Chinese victims who sued the Japanese government for using biological warfare and killing most of their families. There's a still from the Japanese court in Tokyo 2002. This suit, eventually, they lost in 2007. From what I understand, there are about 20 to 30 ongoing lawsuits by Chinese victims against the Japanese government. I have a timer, we don't have much time, so I have to really go through this very quickly. I'm sorry. So, since the 50s, the U.S. government has been declassifying lots of documents about the Japanese biological warfare program. And this is one of them. It really wasn't until the 80s that researchers began to look through all these documents, thousands and thousands of United States government documents about the Japanese biological warfare program. Example one of them. So let's go back to World War II. I don't think in a linear way, so I'm going to lead this talk in sort of a non-linear fashion through the cobwebs of my brain. So first, we define biological warfare, now we go back to World War II. One interesting thing, at least for me, is the beginning of World War II. Usually, as I was taught in high school, it's the Germany's invasion of Poland in 1939. But I'm going to argue that World War II actually started when the Japanese invaded Manchuria in 1931. You also have to remember that it was the first Sino-Japanese war in the late 1890s, which was the time, around that time that Japan annexed Taiwan and Korea. The question is, where is Manchuria? What is Manchuria? It's a term that's not really used today. So here's a little map. Manchuria is a historical name for northeast China. So you can see there's northeast China. There's a couple of cities there. That's Manchuria. So I'm going to lead to a province called Zhejiang province in China and how I got here. Sorry, I'm just trying to go really quickly and I get a lot of coffee. Here's another map. Manchuria would be this area here. There's that famous movie, Manchurian Candidate, was also remade. Manchuria, I guess, in the American imagination, was most recently talked about in this movie, The Last Emperor. I don't know if you've seen it, won an Oscar by Bernardo Bertolucci. Puyi, the last emperor, Chinese emperor, was installed as the puppet emperor of Manchukuo. Manchukuo was a puppet state that the Japanese government created in Manchuria, hence it's called Manchukuo. So if you watch this movie, I think a lot of you have seen this movie, he was installed as the emperor of this fake country called Manchukuo. Here's another map of the area, Google map. You can see the area. Here I'm highlighting a city called Harbin in Chinese. This is in Manchuria. So by Harbin, there's a suburb called Pingfang here. And at Pingfang is where the Japanese created a biological warfare headquarters that in 1941 was designated as Unit 731. So I don't know if you have heard of Unit 731. It was a laboratory to create pathogens, to weaponize germs to kill people. And the name is, for those people who have heard of it, is actually quite famous. Unit 731 was based in this little suburb here. Here's a U.S. government map. Here's Harbin here, and you can see here's Pingfang. So at Pingfang here, at the biological warfare headquarters, the Japanese scientists killed around 3,000 people. And they were killed in the most cruel way you could think of. They were injected with different types of bacteria to see what would happen. And afterwards, they were vivisected. Not dissected, vivisected. Vivisected means you're cut up while you're alive. Dissected means you're cut up after you're dead. They also did other experiments with frostbite, which arguably are probably the cruelest experiments you can inflict on a person. They would go out into the winter. Manchuria was very cold, and they would make these prisoners, mostly Chinese, some Russians, dip their limbs in water and freeze their limbs solid to see what would happen. Because Japan was worried about Russia eventually having to fight the Soviet Union, so that area is very cold. They wanted to see, to test the effects of frostbite and how to combat that when fighting the Soviets, which they would do later. Am I going too quickly? Okay. So here is the front of part of what remains of Unit 731. The Japanese military never called this installation a biological warfare installation. The official name was the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Corps. So it's a euphemism. But they actually did do water purification as well. But it was really a laboratory designed to create biological weapons. Here's an aerial view. Before it was really big. Here's a ruin of a smokestack of what it looks like today. For tourists who go to Harbin, this is one of the biggest tourist spots that there is there, other than the Winter Ice Festival. So for those of you thinking about going to the old Manchuria, be sure to visit Unit 731. You'll see usually a lot of Japanese visitors there. This is a U.S. government map of water purification facilities throughout occupied Asia during World War II. And you can see that there are a lot. Harbin is up here. There's another unit, he gets the number wrong in Nanjing, it's actually Unit 1644 that I will talk about later. But you can see the Japanese military created biological warfare units throughout occupied Asia. And this is a U.S. government report during the war. So the U.S. government already during the war was aware of Japanese biological warfare facilities. Where I'm living now in Taiwan was Unit 31. So here. I'm going to jump to another point in time, to Pearl Harbor. So the United States did not enter World War II right until after Pearl Harbor in 1941. And Pearl Harbor, to a lot of Americans, was a fairly, it was seen as a sneak attack. It really demoralized the American public. So the U.S. government had to find a way to boost morale. And they did that by bombing the Japanese home islands, in particular Tokyo, to show the Japanese that they could fight back. And this is just some newsreel clips, if I can figure out how to play it from PowerPoint. It doesn't seem to play from here. It's already playing.
American morale was pretty low. Then someone had an idea. In those days, before intercontinental bombs, why not bomb Tokyo with B-25s from Terra? The mission was approved. On the green morning of April 18, 1942, Army bombers led by Colonel Xijing flew through the lakes of Victoria, only 500 miles from the cruising pad.
They were launched from aircraft carriers in Japanese waters. And at that time, there were no intercontinental missiles of any sort. So this was actually a really courageous, if not crazy thing to do. And since they were launched from aircraft carriers, they didn't have enough fuel to return. So all of these B-25s that were involved in the bombing of Tokyo, all of them except for one, crashed in or near China, in a particular two provinces of China, Zhejiang province and Jiangxi province. One crash landed in Soviet. But what happened? Here's the crash sites. So that's Zhejiang province. I'll get to that later. Here's some of the crash sites. This little clip is what happened after they crashed. So they just bombed Tokyo, they crashed in China. The first clip is from the great film director Michael Bay.
where his friends in Chongqing.
Chongqing.
Yes, that's right. We go Chongqing.
Chongqing, many days. Many.
Sure. Go dark. Charlie brings after here.
Doctor, 1 week.
1 week. That's a Chinese word.
1 week.
Go. Bring the doctor.
Doctor, Japanese man. Japanese doctor.
So those are two Hollywood versions, over 50 years apart, of what happened after the Doolittle Raiders crashed in China. I find them kind of funny because even this one from 30 Seconds from Tokyo from the 40s, this movie, there's no way that these pilots could have even talked to the Chinese. But I brought something called the pointy-talkie. This is what they used during the war. And there's English. So, for example, you point to, you find, can you get me food? And then there's Chinese. And that's why it's called a pointy-talkie. And that's what they would have used, but it's not very interesting in a Hollywood movie. So the connection of the Bay Area to the Doolittle Raid, there's two significant connections. Travis Air Force Base, which is north, northern Bay Area, there's a museum on the base commemorating the Doolittle Raiders. So you can go there if you're curious. In Alameda, there's an aircraft carrier, decommissioned aircraft carrier called the USS Hornet. And the Hornet is the aircraft carrier from which the Doolittle Raiders launched in Japanese waters. The Hornet that's in Alameda is actually a different one. The original one was sunk by the Japanese near the Philippines. So that's the connection to San Francisco. So what I was interested in is what happened after the raid. In the discourse you would see at the museum, Travis Air Force Base, they'll say that all these American pilots, these downed American pilots, were eventually saved and helped by Chinese peasants and soldiers, and then brought to unoccupied parts of China. They mentioned Chongqing, which is Chongqing. And this is true. But the Japanese military figured this out. And they didn't know that the Americans had launched from aircraft carriers. So they assumed that the Americans had actually launched from Zhejiang province, where they crashed. So in retaliation for the Chinese helping these American pilots, they embarked on a military campaign, which is called the Zhejiang Jiangxi campaign, and they killed 250,000 people. And this aftermath, this 250,000 people, is then what I was led to. Because all the things that I searched, it only mentioned how heroic these Doolittle Raiders are, and it really doesn't mention what happened to the Chinese who helped them. Sorry, I really don't have the drawing count. The beach ball's turning, see? Okay. So here's a video game called Medal of Honor, where it's a first-person shooter and you teenagers can kill Japanese soldiers in the Pacific campaign in 2004. So I don't know if you can see it there, but it talks about the Doolittle Raid casualties. And here it is, the 250,000 Chinese civilians. It's a footnote. This is what interested me, this footnote. And it's even misspelled, retaliation. The footnote. So I looked in deeper into this 250,000 people. I mean, this is a lot of people that the Japanese killed in retaliation for this Doolittle Raid. Last time I went to Travis Air Force Base, I don't remember, maybe 7 years ago, they don't even mention the Chinese who were killed. Here's Zhejiang province in relation to China. So Manchuria is up here, Harbin and Pingfang, where Unit 731 are located, are up here. This is Zhejiang province here. This is where most of these Doolittle Raiders crashed. This is where the Japanese military killed these 250,000 people. After they killed these people, Unit 731, which created all these biological weapons, they employed them all along this railroad and at every airfield they could find in Zhejiang province because they thought the Americans were using those bases to bomb Japan. So from this area, and then also in Nanjing, there's another biological warfare unit. They used a number of pathogens, all in this province. So as you see, as I began my research really in Harbin, Unit 731, and then through the Doolittle raid, I came to Zhejiang province here. Here's another closer view of the Zhejiang Jiangxi Railway. This is Jiangxi province here. Here's Zhejiang province here. Jiangxi province is much poorer. As you know, in China, there's a big problem, disparity between rich and poor as you go farther away from the coastal cities. But this is just giving you an idea of what the railroad was and the area where Unit 731 and Unit 1644 employed biological weapons. So one question people have asked me is, how do you know this happened? Right? If it's not at Travis Air Force Base or in the American history books, how do you know that this happened? Well, there's a lot of proof. I don't know if we go through all the documents I put here, but you can see here's the 1944 U.S. intelligence report, declassified in 2003. This is from the National Archives. And then it even says right here, when Japanese troops overran an area in which a PW attack had been made during the Zhejiang, that's Zhejiang, campaign in 1942, casualties upward of 10,000 resulted in a very brief period of time. So we already know that the U.S. government was aware of the Japanese biological warfare program early in World War II. In 1944, they were also aware of estimates of casualties. A lot of this information comes from captured POWs. Here's another document. 1947. This is after the war. And this is another interrogation of Japanese prisoners. I put this document here because why wasn't, for example, in high school, I was never taught about Japanese biological warfare. Why isn't this history more well known? The main reason is that the U.S. government, in particular MacArthur, gave immunity to anybody who was involved in biological weapons production and dissemination, because the U.S. government wanted this data for themselves. Soviet Union and the United States at that time didn't usually test biological weapons on live humans. They had a certain moral problem with doing it, right? It sounds like it's really bad to do that. But eventually the United States and Soviet Union did test on live people. But the United States wanted this data, so they didn't prosecute them at the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal, which was in 1946. The Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal is the counterpart to the Nuremberg trial in Germany where they tried high-ranking Nazis. Am I going too quickly? No.
No.
So this important part is...
Can you put it on white full screen?
So the important part here is that the value to the U.S. of this data is to far outweigh the value accruing from war crimes prosecution. Here's another memo. Documentary immunity in war crimes, giving the high rationale. So this is why this story had been kept secret for so long in the United States and in Japan. What's the other proof? How do we know that the Japanese military did this? This is a documentary from 2001 called Japanese Devils. Chinese would call, and older Chinese still call Japanese devils, and because of the war. And this documentary interviews a lot of the perpetrators. So I wanted to play one of Yoshio Shinozuka, who, yes, he doesn't play.
Maybe with the space bar.
No, just move up to the image.
I have to go to the slide view to play the embedded videos.
私が入ることになった時は本来テストしだすこと7歳では出ましたけれども、反則これらの大量説これを開始しております。ワクチン予防用ワクチンと自分たちの作った細菌との力関係、果たして予防ワクチンに打ち勝つことができるのか、感染させることができるのか、これが目的であったと思います。この実験には5人の中国の方を使うと申しますか、残酷な方法で殺害しました。ペストでしたので、ペストに対する抵抗がどの程度あるのか、これらをまず調べる。一人の人については、いわゆる対象として予防ワクチンをしない。その他の4人の人については、ワクチンを注射する。これは7歳で開発したというエンベローワクチンというのを開発したと、その人たちに注射して感染させる。予防注射をしなかった人は3日ぐらいで瀕死の状態になりました。解剖が始まってから私が命じられているのは、内臓を取り出し、一部を雑巾培地というコルベンの中に入れるという。もう一つは切り刻んだ一部を内臓別にシャレ、ガラスのシャレですが、そこに書いてあるに従って塗りつける。こういう仕事、これが一番最初に参加した僕の状況で、このようなことが終わった後は私たちは自分たちの体では現実に消毒して出て、これが最初でしたが、そのようにしてあと2名の人を殺害します。あとの2名の方については、私たちではなしに、まだ真摯の状況にならなかったということもあったと思いますけれども、この人たちは診療部に渡した。7歳についたら診療部に渡した。これは私たちはまるたもう私たち世帯介護とかそれがある人。
So this man, Shinozuka-san, he's still alive. I have a little anecdote. In the 90s, he was invited by some NGOs to come to the United States and Canada to talk about his experiences, because he's one of the very few people who worked at Unit 731 who would publicly talk about what they did there. And U.S. and Canadian governments wouldn't let him into their respective countries because he was considered a war criminal, which is kind of interesting, though he was never prosecuted as such. He's still alive. He lives on the outskirts of Tokyo. I saw him a couple months ago. He doesn't want to talk about what he had done anymore because he was interviewed by German television, ZDF. And ZDF had accused him of being a war criminal. And so after that, he no longer will talk about what he has done at Unit 731. But anyway, I'm just showing at Unit 731, they killed about 3,000 people and tested on them. They also employed these germs throughout China as field tests. The whole point was to create weapons and then see if they worked. You have to test these weapons to see if they worked well. And what better place to try to test these weapons is other than China. I mean, it's an inexhaustible supply of people to kill. And we'll go back now to Zhejiang if I know actually figure out how to do it. So here it is again. The railway around where the two little raiders crashed, and these little dots are little villages. And colloquially, in Chinese, they're known as rotten leg villages. They're known as rotten leg villages because there are, or at least were, thousands of surviving victims from this Zhejiang Jiangxi campaign in 1942 when the Japanese military used these biological weapons. And they're called rotten leg because the Japanese would spray, for instance, these pathogens in fields and such. They would also poison well water or food. And when the peasants would walk through the grass, some of the grass would cut their legs, and the bacteria would enter their bodies through their legs. So the infection sites were usually localized on the legs. I think I only have 7 minutes, so I'm going to skip some things. Here's another government report, and these are some of the diseases that they used. So you can see anthrax, botulism, cholera, lots of diseases. And the one that I eventually focused on is called glanders. You see it there near the top, glanders. So glanders is a disease that usually naturally occurs in primarily horses, mules, and donkeys. This document we saw earlier, the report of G, the G stands for this disease, glanders. This is a report that the Japanese Unit 71 scientists wrote for the U.S. government to explain to the U.S. government exactly what tests they did with this disease, this bacterium called glanders. So you can see there that those days, those numbers are how many days these people survived. These are some of the victims. This is glanders naturally occurring on a horse. As you see, it favors the legs. Anthrax, that the Japanese also used, is a naturally occurring disease that in sheep. And anthrax is a bit more famous here in the United States because of 9/11. That particular strain, from what I understand, that was sent in the mail, comes from a diseased sheep in Colorado that was then later weaponized by the United States government. But here is in Zhejiang province an example of a man with anthrax, cutaneous anthrax scars. So these types of bacteria you can generally get 3 ways. You eat them, you inhale them, or you get them on your skin. And for these people, they usually got them on their skin. The people who inhaled it or ate it usually died within 2 weeks. I don't know how much time we have. This is only a minute. This is an example of cutaneous anthrax. This is a classical example of cutaneous anthrax. You get anthrax on your skin. I just have to warn you, some of the images are going to be even more graphic. Here's an example of a victim with glanders, an open wound from glanders, not anthrax. This man's name is Xu Fa. He's from Zhejiang province. He committed suicide earlier this year by eating pesticide because he thought he was a burden on his family and his wounds were too painful. Okay, we can go on to the next one. I only have 2 minutes. Why are these people still alive? Why have they had these wounds for over 70 years? When dealing with bacteria or viruses, some people are just naturally stronger. Their immune systems are naturally stronger. So these victims around these mountain-like villages, usually they were children, these were 70 years ago, they just, their bodies resisted the pathogens, so they survived. But they didn't have access to antibiotics, so they could never cure the infection, but the infection would never kill them. So they have had these open wounds for 70 years. And this is what interested me the most, that these people had these wounds as literally markers of history, markers of what Unit 731 had done in China. And at least a few years ago, the Chinese government didn't deal with this issue because the Japanese government was still giving loans, ODA loans, to the Chinese government. They also, the Chinese government also didn't like to portray itself as a victim. So this story was really kept quiet. But I have a minute. I began to focus on a city called Jiangshan. It's it's right there, that A. So you can see it's not so far from Shanghai or Hangzhou. Hangzhou is actually a very rich city. I made a short talk about this man. His name is Jiang Chongdeng. Quick thing I'll say is, you see his shoes that he's wearing? Those were shown at in Hong Kong at Parasite. He showed that into curator. This man gave me his shoes because he can no longer walk. The other anecdote is, because I followed this man for a number of years. I organized a fundraiser for him in Taiwan to... I organized a fundraiser for him in Taiwan to pay for amputation because if he doesn't get his legs amputated, he will die within a couple of months. And once we got some money, and then I went back to tell him, he told me that I have to speak to him very slowly. The manner is, very bad. He wants his legs. He wants his legs for the next life. If he gets amputation, then in the next life he won't have any legs and he won't be able to walk. And it's just this idea of the afterlife that I could not shape for him. So the only thing we can do is to give him painkillers and dreams and other things. But if I get a chance to go back to China to see him, I will again try to convince him to amputate his legs. Otherwise, I think he's going to die in 1 month. If we had more time, I was going to show you a clip. We'll show the last clip. It's 5 minutes. This is very personal. So, close your eyes if you want to.
你这样很多人来的，就是他们说现在可以，你看这个脚看进去。
I'm just going to add, I'm going to get rid of this. The reactions that I see in some of you, this is this same type of reaction I had at the beginning, and it was a big problem how do you represent these people? Why do it? And what they told me, the victims would tell me eventually is that they knew they were going to die, they knew they were going to be killed by these wounds, and they wanted other people, particularly in the West, to know that their deaths at least wouldn't be so meaningless. They would, people in other countries would know the suffering that they had gone through. And that's why why they were so willing to show. Also, I was one of the very few people who showed any interest in these people at all. Most people are disgusted, right? I mean, it's terrible. There are very few people who can stomach even going there and talking to them, writing down their stories and trying to figure out what happened and what they could do to make themselves feel better. In this way, my artistic practice, I guess, follows a certain activism. And I'm not an activist. My aim has never been to really be an activist. But I guess, in this sense, I sort of am, because I'm the only one who even cares. So this is sort of how my obsession about biological warfare led me from Manchuria to this city, the Zhejiang province called Zhejiang. Okay, thanks.
Every time I see that footage, I just start sobbing. I can see some of that reaction in the audience today. How many guys have never heard about this, village of rotting legs? No one, right? And so your question about why, in high school you had never heard about this. I know that, you have a family connection to Tibet and the Taiwanese, the Taiwan, and connected through China. And then we also talked earlier about, it's so harrowing watching this and, your political agenda, and that I also do work with traumas of history, representation, and I was saying how emotionally difficult it is to deal with it and also to process. And you say you get used to it, and I was really interested. And there's a poet, Xijing, who writes, there's a line from a poem, he writes, "All this and love too will ruin us. Tell me we will never get used to it." So this is something like, how do you get used to it? And I was really interested in this idea of history, and Michel Roquefort, this historian and philosopher, he writes about the Haitian Revolution and what is remembered and what's forgotten. And a lot of your work is about what is forgotten or what is visible or hypervisible, or totally invisible, as we see in this work that we don't really know about it. So I was really interested in, and I'm sure the audience might be interested in as well, these archives that you work with and your own body of work as forming a sort of archive. So you can talk about how you first came across the materials, and then also, of course, these people as a sort of archive as well.
I've been interested in biological warfare for maybe 7 or 8 years now, and I've gone to China many times, starting in the north, in Manchuria, going down the railroad through occupied cities, and then eventually ending up in Zhejiang. Now when I return to China, I always go back usually to this area, Zhejiang province, the poor area that's next to Jiangxi province. And I guess what I've done is create, or try to create a certain archive, documents that I guess are the last documents of some of these people. And this is what they wanted me to do. They wanted people to see. And most people, like the Chinese who live in the area, they know or have heard about these rock-like villages, but they avoid them. So I guess this is they themselves are a sort of neglected archive. These people, what they saw, what they experienced through this time. Another literal archive are the National Archives of Washington, D.C. Most of the declassified documents come from there. The United States government is actually pretty good about declassifying old government documents, and other foreign documents have since followed suit. And now with WikiLeaks and Snowden, more things come to light. So, I don't know if I answered the question.
Just thinking about trauma and the politics of witnessing, well, there's this, like this, you said, this is a secret, right? It's hasn't been known for a while, and you have a personal political connection, as do I. For instance, there's the Nixon secret war, in which 2 million tons of bombs were just dropped in South Asia, and how many of you guys know about this? There's like more tons of bombs than World War II combined. So, but then there's also kind of theories around making work about minor events. So, for example, Zhejiang, she talks about this cottage industry of films, conferences, talks, like the one we're at right now, which talks about historical trauma. And she says that it might be just a form of navel gazing, and she says, in short, it's a form of, and we talked about cannibalism earlier, cannibalizing trauma. So there's this article in which you talk about your 2012 trip to Zhejiang province with the researchers about the afterlife of the World War II Japanese drug warfare, you're right. So I had looked at the so-called Holocaust tourists, and then I became one. I'm also a, quote, Japanese atrocity tourist, as I have toured sites throughout China and Asia. Get in, get out, get some shots, and then get out. So I was wondering, all of us, as audience members, as witnesses, and as cultural producers, what are our responsibilities? And in a way, are we cannibalizing trauma? So, kind of the political dimensions of that.
I don't think I can give a sophisticated answer to such a sophisticated question, but I can say that there are 2 reasons that I became interested in this, and I already mentioned. One is obsession. As an artist, you follow your obsession. Some people are obsessed with anime and comic books. I'm obsessed with biological warfare. Why not? Some reasons are, I guess, I'm afraid I'm a germaphobe. I'm afraid of germs. And the thought of being killed by these invisible entities to me is quite frightening. Maybe that's one reason I'm obsessed with biological warfare. And then the other reason is, in going back, these people would tell me to document them before they die. And this is a long time ago, so every time I go back, there are less and less of them because they're old, they're dying. And it's, if I had more money and more time, I would go back and try to document them all. There are Chinese activists, a very small group of them in China, who are trying to document and interview the remaining survivors. And this includes some college students based in Kabul, which is a coastal city in Zhejiang province.
This is the last question before I open up to audience questions. And to lighten it up, it's actually about humor. Because as you can see, even in your presentation, there's going to pause some laughs. And I think we're going to use the pointy looky book right now to open it up. So in this Brooklyn Rail interview, Penny Lane, thanks for using this book. Just kidding. She talks about your unexpected use of humor in some of your work, even when 731, given this really grim, sensitive subject matter. Can you talk about, and then of course there's 10K 101, which talks about things for other stuff. But can you talk about this use of humor or sarcasm as a strategy?
I think humor results with the audience response to, it's a body response to not being able to digest what you've seen. So you laugh, or you fall. For me, it's not funny at all. I find the pointy talkie kind of cool. I don't find it funny at all. But I've never intentionally gone out to use humor. I'm not a comedian. And I actually don't think my work is particularly funny. It's the audience response to what they see.
Sometimes artists say they use humor as a way to blend and strategy, but Also, there are other people that talk about humor as people laugh because it's sort of discomfort. You don't know how to respond. Either you cry or you laugh or both. That can be both.
If anything, I think I take things too seriously. I over-identify. I don't see any of this as funny. I mean, I do admit, going there so many times, I mean, you mentioned earlier, you get used to it. You get used to the dirty conditions, the smell. The wounds have the smell, like rotting meat. You get used to it. There's nothing funny about it. There's no humor. And then the work, I don't know if there's humor, that's something they do on internet. It's not something I intentionally do.
Yeah, I just found this weird thing that when you look. Are there any Japanese or puppet fortified points on the way? So we're going to open it up to questions.
So I have a really more like personal question when you're dealing with these materials. Just by the coming up from the government, we're also seeing the trend of refusal and silencing from the general public when they're when they're confronted with these kind of materials. Particularly, I think on the comfort women cases last year in China. The television basically publicly rejected the exhibition on comfort women and saying that they should be receiving the treatment in a secluded area or something. So I think after many years since the war happened, we're seeing more materials from that, but then we're also seeing a lot more refusal from that. And then as a filmmaker, how do you deal with that particular sort of thing that not necessarily from the government, but just from the general public that you interact with?
Well, I know that this type of topic is fairly gruesome and most people will not enjoy watching it. I was totally aware of that, but I followed my obsessions. I had to go and see it for myself. Comfort women, I mean, I screened yesterday, and there were some Chinese students from Zhejiang province who came to screen, and they talked about how they want to go back to China and then document some of these surviving comfort women, victims from the Xijing massacre, and other Japanese atrocities. And then I was telling them that you cannot group all these things together. That the only point that certain people, the Chinese government, group these issues together is to make people, particularly Chinese, hate the Japanese and ignore their own domestic problems. So I like to separate these different issues. So Xijing massacre, for instance, there's a lot of movies made about it. Comfort women, I think the Koreans have been very vocal about the comfort women issue. I don't deal with that. I focus specifically on biological warfare. Another example is in Glendale, outside of LA, a suburb of LA, a Korean group erected a statue, a comfort women statue, and a lot of older Japanese were opposed to it. But I didn't, just an example that this type of issue, I guess other people are dealing with, and I don't see it as covered up. In fact, I think the most popular, if you call it popular, issue about Japanese atrocities is probably the issue of comfort women. Because it's the issue that I guess, as women, you can understand most, easily. You can sympathize with.
I think that becomes the history of what is remembered or what is memorialized, what becomes politically visible, right? So the Glendale example, controversial, is also one. Texas, about another one. Big into your question.
Thank you very much for your talk. And I also thought it was interesting that you had an interest on how certain moving image, certain film production serves as a post testimony, especially like World War movies. I was wondering, like, in relation to film, moving image, and technology and war today, how do you see like perhaps immediate oblivion in, for example, what's happening nowadays with chemical weapons in Syria? So you described that most of these biological weapons and the victims are in the shadow of just basically ignorance, you know, about what happened in that specific area throughout the years of the war. And nowadays, when we have immediate digital, almost live testimony over a chemical weapon, there's still a kind of like another kind of oblivion or immediate oblivion, you know, or there's obviously reaction and close reaction, but emotional attachment to the images is also, there's also no affect at the same time. You know? Just if you could comment on how do you personally see this relationship with how we actually do know nowadays of immediate chemical weapons?
I was going to talk about what I call the economy of victims, and I think one reason that this issue has been sort of hidden or ignored, especially by the West, is that they're primarily Chinese. Who cares if 250,000 Chinese were killed? Every year there are floods in China or earthquakes, 50,000 are killed, 100,000 are killed. What does it matter? It doesn't matter at all. And with the images you see from Syria, these sarin gas attacks, which is chemical, not biological. Most Americans don't want to do anything about it. They don't care because they're separated. It doesn't matter. They're Syrians. They're not Americans. So when I come back to the States and I watch the news, there's news about this girl is missing in Alabama. 5 people died in flooding in Colorado or something. As if I'm supposed to care. These 5 Americans are dead. But then 250,000 people drowned in Sichuan province or something. Nobody here cares. It's the economy of victims. Certain victims are more important than others. This is the truth. To put it in another way, the atomic bomb victims at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, around 250,000 or so. Those people are generally privileged as victims. The Jews, the Ukrainian Jews in the Holocaust, the Gypsies, the homosexuals, they're more privileged victims. But these Chinese victims, it doesn't matter. They don't matter too much.
I don't disagree with your statement at all, except to say that I think the reason we don't care so much has not much to do with them being Chinese and more to do with the fact that we as Americans didn't kill them. I think we care about Japanese victims because we dropped the bombs and we feel guilty, but we can blame the Japanese for this, and therefore it's not our problem.
And also within trauma studies or just in trauma representation, there is a sort of hierarchy of visibility. How come we all know, this discourse about the Holocaust, but we don't know about other genocides, etc., that certain things become over-visible or hyper-visible, and then other things that James is working with doesn't register for certain political reasons. And becomes a war of images also.
I talked to Xinhua. Xinhua is like the Chinese AP, and they were saying, to them, they report on stories all the time about thousands of Chinese dying from some kind of natural disaster or other, and they don't care. Why? Because they're Chinese. Because there's so many Chinese. It doesn't matter if a couple of thousand people die.
Maybe one more question?
Maybe it's not necessarily a question, but more a remark. It's not only this kind of hierarchy of victims, like it's also like what media can do about it. I think in China there's also like what you mentioned before, the reluctance of Chinese government to kind of like report about it because it would kind of like when it's about political stories, it would prove them weak, or as they don't want to be portrayed as victims, but not by themselves either. So there's kind of like, I think the Jewish victims of the Second World War, they could install a huge propaganda machine to kind of like use their victimship in political pressure in the world afterwards, which is still a big difference with the gypsies that were victims instead. So I think some of the things were mentioned in a very generalizing way, and I think it's more differentiated how this economy of victims is organized in the world. It's like, okay, we talk about Chinese today. Who knows how many Rwandese were killed, how many people in the Central African Republic were killed, etc. So it's kind of like it's not part of the discussion. And I think it's very interesting to bring that in, and I think it's very important to be very precise. And I think there's a very big difference between the Jewish victims in the Second World War, Gypsy victims, and the homosexual victims, etc. So it's great, but at the same time, I would remark to be more precise at some point, because those things are, well, they're too important to get away in a generalization, I think.
I must say, my work is not about the Holocaust, but I only mention that as an example in this little few minutes that we've got. I think there's a lot of other artists and filmmakers, documentarians who can deal with the Holocaust in a way that I never could.
Thank you very much.